Welcome to Crosspointe.
Welcome to Crosspointe.
Welcome to Crosspointe.
We are an inclusive faith community
seeking to live out the loving, just, and generous way of Jesus.
We are participants in a long tradition
that's less concerned with doctrines and dogma that demand total agreement,
but a life to be lived, enjoyed, and given away to others.
What unites us is a growing awareness that life is precious.
That we are made by love in order to love.
This community is comprised of and affirms the entire human family.
Regardless of race, age, creed,
physical abilities, marital or economic status,
gender identity, or sexual orientation.
So, if you're curious and have come to see,
if you are tired and have come to rest,
if you are grateful and have come to share,
if you are wounded and have come to heal,
if you're joyful and have come to celebrate,
if you are uprooted and have come to belong,
welcome home.
Welcome home.
Welcome home.
Welcome home.
It's too far to walk alone. You can't do it on your own. It's like bare hands digging through stone. And if things go down much steeper hills, even money won't pay these bills. But time is sure to show that people gonna be okay. Storms never come to stay. They just show us how bad we need each other, how bad we need each other. And the trials of today, there are signs along the way to remind us how bad we need each other, how bad we need each other. Sometimes feels like I'm drifting a million miles from this planet. But what a shame it would be to look back on my life and realize that I've taken you and you for granted. People gonna be okay. Storms never come to stay. They just show us how bad we need each other, how bad we need each other. And the trials of today, there are signs along the way to remind us how bad we need each other, how bad we need each other. I can't see what's a mile around the bend. I do not know where this world is headed or where it may end. But you gave me this smile, so I threw away my frown. And I ain't gonna pick up, no you don't pick up what you just put down. People gonna be okay. Storms never come to stay. They just show us how bad we need each other, how bad we need each other. And the trials of today, there are signs along the way to remind us how bad we need each other, how bad we need each other. Are people gonna be okay? Storms never come to stay. They just show us how bad we need each other, how bad we need each other. And the trials of today, there are signs along the way to remind us how bad we need each other, how
caused you trouble. I went too far. These off-white shoes don't have their soles anymore. I crossed the desert, then crossed a line. Unchecked the boxes, then I sent them up in fire. And I lost it all on my way to the juniper tree. And I filled my lungs with something holy. I hid my head between my knees. I climbed a mountain and I mourned myself in peace. I took communion, then took some rest, then heard the faint familiar whisper in my chest, and I found my soul at the foot of the juniper tree. And I filled my lungs with something holy. What if I dared you? What if I cared? What if I gave you permission? I give you permission to fill up your chest and hold it up high, or hold it in close like the first love letter you wrote. It's yours. Fill your lungs with something. Oh, fill your lungs with something. Oh, fill your lungs with something. Oh. I crossed the desert back to my home and spoke aloud the words I needed you to know. I found it all in the shade of the juniper tree. Come fill your lungs with something holy.
Good morning, Crosspointe. I want to thank you for joining us, whether you're joining us online or in person. I want to take a few moments to talk specifically to parents of littles. If your children are ages 2 through 5th grade, we want to invite you to sign them up for Parents Night Out, which is next Saturday, March 11th from 5 to 9 p.m. If you want to register your children, you're going to go to crosspointe.org/parentsnightout. And what this is going to look like is that you're going to drop them off at 5 p.m. And for the next 4 hours, our student ministry serve teams will engage them in activities and games. We'll make a craft. Of course, we'll have some downtime. We'll eat some dinner. And then hopefully when you pick them up later in the evening, they will be good and tired and ready to go to bed. And hopefully you will have had an evening to do whatever you would like to do. You can have date night. You can take a really good nap or catch up on shows or do a home improvement project without littles underfoot. So I want to share with you that the cost of this event is $30 for one child and $50 for 2 or more children. And all of the proceeds of this event go to benefit our student ministry service trips this summer. So you may or may not know that our high school students are going to Jackson, Mississippi this summer to serve alongside the local church there. We'll also visit the Civil Rights Museum. That will be an incredible growth opportunity for our kids. And our middle school students will go to an undisclosed location, and they will serve with a variety of nonprofits. Last summer, we went to Philadelphia and Baltimore and Washington, D.C., and students served in diaper banks, food banks, homeless shelters. It's a really powerful experience for our students to get to see all of the need that is out there in the world, and that they get to participate in the good work of helping others. I consider it a privilege to see how much our students grow as a result of these experiences. There are a lot of factors at play. We're in different parts of our country. It's disorienting for our students to be outside of their comfort zone, but I tend to think that that's a good thing, that they grow in new ways when they're having to be stretched in that way. It confronts a lot inside of us to be aware of how very much need there is in our world, but it's also really empowering for our students to get to participate in that. So these are incredible experiences for our students, but frankly, they cost a lot of money. And so I want to share with you that if you choose to participate in Parents' Night Out, all of that money is going to offset the cost of these student ministry trips, and we thank you for that. If you are interested in all of the other good things that are going on at Crosspointe and you want to financially contribute to that, you can do that a variety of ways. You can do that through stocks, PayPal, debit cards. You can go to crosspointe.org/contribute and you can give there. You can also text Crosspointe NC to 77977, which will send a link to your phone, and you can choose there how you'd like to give. Thanks, Crosspointe.
Hey, Crosspointe. As always, it's really good to be with you again today. So a few weeks ago, Steve asked for feedback on topics or ideas that all of you would like to hear our teaching team perhaps address at some point. So we got lots of great responses, so thank you for that. And one of those topics that appeared multiple times was people looking for help in dealing with grief. And so I want to step into those waters a bit with you this morning. And by nature, whenever any of us face grief, it carries a certain heaviness with it. There's a weight to it. In fact, the words gravity and grief share the same etymology. They come from the same ancient root words. And so that makes sense, not simply from how we speak about it, but how we as humans have always experienced grief, that there's this weight and heaviness to it. And so I want to look at a book included in the Bible that was written about 2,500 years ago. And for me, I find it strangely helpful at times to be able to look back on the experiences of ancient people and discover some resonance with how they felt so that I don't feel so alone in my own experiences, or convince myself that no one else has ever felt the way that I feel in a particular moment. And when it comes to grief, there's perhaps no better place to look than the book of Lamentations, which by its title alone tells us what it's about. It's a collection of laments, which the dictionary defines laments as, quote, the passionate expressions of grief. Now, to best understand the heart of this book, Lamentations, I think it's best that we try to understand what the author is trying to do with it as a whole collection and the context from which it originates. So let's first start with the genre. Lamentations is a book of poetry. In fact, it's a collection of 5 poems, sort of functioning together as one collection. Now, today in our particular cultural context, when these poems have been translated from the original language of Hebrew into English, it's understandably very easy to miss that important piece of information, that they're poetry, because if we don't understand that it's poetry, that it's designed to be a piece of art, we can definitely miss the large canvas painting it is. And we can find ourselves trying to focus in on individual brushstrokes in the bigger painting and finding ourselves very confused, trying to make something out of it that it just isn't. We often talk about how that happens with Genesis chapter 1 and 2 in the Bible with the story of creation, how those are written in poetry in Hebrew as well, and how when we don't understand that genre, we can make something out of those texts that were never intended. So again, understanding the genre is critical to how we understand this collection of poems called Lamentations. Then secondly, we have to also talk about the historical context. This collection of laments is written from the perspective of those people who experienced the trauma of Jerusalem being destroyed by the Babylonians in 500s BCE. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon led his troops into the sacred Jewish city of Jerusalem and just completely wiped it out, slaughtering people left and right, taking women and children as slaves, stealing everything that was worth stealing, and then they just burned the rest. They ransacked the temple, and they left only a handful of Jews behind to work the land as essentially slave labor for the Babylonians. It was this brutal devastation that catalyzed generations of trauma. And so throughout the poems, different metaphors are introduced to depict the pain and suffering of Jerusalem. And so you have these different characters who weave in and out of the story in the poems a bit as they tell their different stories. And then lastly, if we want to try to understand what this piece of art is trying to communicate, we also have to talk about how the poems are structured and arranged. Now, as I mentioned before, there's 5 poems, and they coincide with the 5 different chapters that we find in the book today. Now, I want you to notice how they break down. In the 5 chapters, chapter 1, there's 22 verses. In chapter 2, there's also 22 verses. But in chapter 3, there's triple the amount. There's 66 verses. And then in chapter 4, it goes back to 22 verses. And then chapter 5, 22 verses. Now, why is that significant? Well, I want to show you another slide. This is the original Hebrew alphabet, which has 22 letters. Aleph, Bet, Gimel, etc. And in the first poem of chapter 1, the first poem, the first line of the poem begins with Aleph. The second line begins with Bet. The third line begins with Gimel. All 22 verses begin with the sequential corresponding letter of the 22-letter Hebrew alphabet. It would be the equivalent of us writing a poem in English today with 26 lines, where the first line begins with A, the second line begins with B, then C, D, E, and F, all the way through to Z. Now, in chapter 2, this same pattern repeats itself. And then in chapter 3, again, you'll notice that there's 3 times the number of verses. So in chapter 3, the first 3 lines start with Aleph, 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 then Bet, 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 Gimel, 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 and so on. And then in chapter 4, it goes back to the original pattern with Aleph, Bet, Gimel, and then lastly in chapter 5, the collection stays with the pattern of 22 verses, but it breaks the pattern of the sequential letters of the alphabet and serves more as a separate concluding prayer that functions a bit outside the other 4 poems that all work together. Now, here's the thing. I don't know about you, but I spent years and years in and around church and around the Bible and never heard anything like this for the longest period of time. And when I did, I was like, well, this makes the Bible way more interesting to me. To know that certain writers are using art to communicate different ideas that go way beyond just arguing about the words on a page, it was like, mind-blowing to me. And it still captures my attention today in ways that it never previously did. And still, I share all that detail about the structure of the poem, not simply because I just think it's interesting, but because later on we're going to see that it seems key to what the author is trying to communicate. But before we get there, I want to make some observations from parts of the poem and give you a glimpse of what the author is doing here. In chapter 1, a woman gets introduced, and her character serves as kind of the personification of the city of Jerusalem that has gone through all this devastation. And in verse 13, she says, "From on high the Lord sent fire, sent it down into my bones. He spread a net for my feet and turned me back. He made me desolate, faint all the day long. This is why I weep and my eyes overflow with tears. No one is near to comfort me, no one to restore my spirit. My children are destitute because the enemy has prevailed." And then one verse later, she says this, "The Lord is righteous, yet I rebelled against his command. I called to my allies, but they betrayed me." So right from the beginning, the poem illustrates that pain and hurt and grief carry with them a whole lot of complex emotions. The voice of the woman is really all over the map. It's trying to assign blame and figure out who's responsible for the devastation that has happened to everything that she holds dear. So at first it's it's God's fault. God is mad and he did this to me. And then it's, well, no, the Lord's good. This isn't my fault. This is because of my sin. I'm reaping what I've sown here. And then it's, well, wait, why didn't my friends come and help me? I mean, they're the ones who betrayed me. And so she's all over the place, grasping to understand who's at fault in this scenario. And many of us can relate to that when we go through pain, right? That we can find ourselves all over the map, bouncing around, sometimes even moment by moment, trying to figure out how this happened and who's to blame. And in that process, all these metaphors get used to try to communicate the hurt. Author Rob Bell talks about how sometimes in the thick of trauma, literal language fails us and we resort to metaphors. And we've probably all found ourselves doing that from time to time. I mean, we don't say, you know what, I'm very disappointed someone shared something untrue about me to another person, right? I mean, instead we say something like, I can't believe they stabbed me in the back. Or in the same way, we don't say, well, an unfortunate incident just happened that grieves me. Rather, we say something like, I just feel like my heart got ripped out of my chest, or I feel like someone just kicked me in the gut and choked the life out of me. And here's the thing. That's the overwhelming majority of the book of Lamentations. It's a lament, an artistic expression of grief and sorrow. And the thing is, the poem doesn't offer any answers at any point. There aren't any explanations. There's no solutions provided. It doesn't try to tie everything up in a nice little bow. It's simply a lament, a crying out, trying to sort through the pain. And frankly, that's awkward and even hard for many of us because we live in a culture that doesn't know how to talk about really painful things well at all. So as a result, it can be very tempting to just sweep things under the rug and avoid talking about real hurts and wounds. Some of you know this because you grew up in a home like that. Some of you, you've been a part of teams like that, or it's just how you find yourself regularly having to navigate relationships where no one really talks about painful things that have happened. They just kind of get swept under the rug. Now understand, I'm not talking about petty things and needing to bring up every little thing that annoys you or rubs you the wrong way. I'm talking about deep wounds that need to be addressed. Even if it can't be with a specific person or needs to just be addressed with a counselor, but regardless, they need to be addressed. I mean, think about how things might have been different with a parent if there could have been some way to talk about certain hurts and process them. How things could have been different with a spouse, with a child, with an employer, with a friend, if there was a way to push through the awkwardness and not just shove everything under the rug and not deal with it, but instead found a way to talk about the pain. Because here's what we all know. The pain doesn't just eventually go away. Pain finds a way to express itself one way or the other. And when it's not verbally and vulnerably processed, sometimes it expresses itself through destructive patterns and behavior, sometimes through addiction, sometimes through warped filters of how we value ourselves and how we value others. One way or another, pain always finds a way to express itself. And so when we consider this book of Lamentations a book, we're understanding God is never recorded as speaking, a book where there's no solutions or explanations given for the trauma and pain that people have experienced, but where instead it's mostly all just a crying out and expressing pain. It's good to be reminded that finding a way to lament well is a necessary yet often overlooked part of the human experience that God isn't threatened by. But rather what we see in this book, God rather seems to embrace it and invite it. We read this near the beginning of the first poem, where the woman says, "Look, O Lord, and consider, for I am despised. Is it nothing to you, all who pass by? Look around and see, is any suffering like my suffering that was inflicted on me?" These are actually the first words that the poem has the woman speaking. And the words are simply this plea for God or for anyone to notice and acknowledge the pain that she's going through. And as she progresses, she gets more and more frustrated. How can you just walk by? Don't you see what I'm going through? Will someone just pay attention? And the thing is, when we're hurting, how often do we just want someone to listen to us? To acknowledge the pain that we're going through. But then there's this progression that happens when we feel like no one is hearing us, where we move from being sad to being angry. When it continues to go unnoticed, our words and our attitude develop an edge to them, often a sharp edge, and it's this cry to be heard. And yet what each of us knows is that when we're going through something painful and someone says, "That must have been so hard. I can't imagine how you dealt with that." Something about that is incredibly life-giving. There's something incredibly soothing about someone simply acknowledging our hurt. And so it's not surprising that the woman's first words would be, "Does anyone notice?" And when there seems to be no response, what we find in the poem is that the intensity of the lament only increases. The sense of desperation and anger only continues to grow with each passing stanza, and it arguably reaches its apex at this point in chapter 3, where the character says, "He has broken my teeth," meaning God. God has broken my teeth with gravel. He has trampled me in the dust. Because honestly, it doesn't get much more intense than having your teeth broken with gravel, right? And then verse 17, "I have been deprived of peace. I have forgotten what prosperity is. So I say, my splendor is gone and all that I hoped from the Lord. I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I well remember them, and my soul is downcast within me." The character in this part of the poem, again, is blaming God. God has done this to me, trampled me, and all hope is gone. But then, seemingly out of nowhere, there's this dramatic shift in the very next verse. Check this out in verse 21. "Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness." And we read that, and there's this sense of like, wait a second, where did that come from? Because it seemed like there was all this rage and anger toward God and like no hope at all. And then suddenly it's, I remember God's compassion never fails and that God is faithful. And therefore I have hope. One commentator on the book of Lamentations, Kathleen O'Connor, writes, "In Lamentations, what we discover is that hope and horror stand side by side. Hope and honesty stand side by side. Hope and contradiction stand side by side." And for many of us, we know exactly how that feels. Yet often what happens is that hope gets presented to us as the absence of other feelings like doubt or anger or sadness, when the reality is very often all those feelings dance together. And the very best we can muster is to try to hold all those seemingly opposite emotions together in tension at the same time. And when you read through the entirety of all the poems in Lamentations, this is really the only time that someone expresses any kind of hope. And it's right in the middle of all this raw pain and anger and despair and everything else. And there's something strangely comforting about that. And intentional. Because remember when we talked about the structure of the poem earlier? When you take the first 4 poems of Lamentations, that all follow the same pattern of each line beginning with the next letter of the alphabet. Because again, the 5th poem breaks that pattern and serves more as a closing prayer. But when you take the first 4 and you add up the total number of verses that all follow the same pattern, there's 132 total verses. So again, the intensity of the poem builds all the way up, and then at the exact midpoint, verse 66, out of 132 verses, the verse that sits at the center of the entire lament is Lamentations 3:22. That says, "Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness." Which is led into by verse 65 right before it. Verse 21 says, "Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope." And so in the midst of all the rawness of emotion and confusion that so easily floods my mind, the author's saying, I will choose to remember that my honest feelings don't threaten or offend God. And that because of God's great love, we are not consumed. I will call to mind. I will discipline myself to remember, great is thy faithfulness. Great is God's faithfulness. And somehow, in this ancient book from 2,500 years ago, written by people who experienced more trauma than most of us could have ever imagined, they felt the freedom to be brutally honest about their emotions and experiences. And yet at the center of it all They still fought to cling to a story that refused to let all hope be lost. Which thousands of years later still feels like a story that you and I get invited into. Now, with the last few minutes that we have together, I want to offer some additional thoughts around grief that I hope may be helpful. I won't spend a lot of time unpacking each of them, but instead I'm just going to simply try to give you some brief handles to hold on to as you navigate your own journey with grief and as you walk with others through theirs. And one is that as painful as it is, we have to understand and be reminded that grief is a language of love. Grief only comes out of love. You don't find grief where there is no love. Sometimes you'll hear people say things like, well, it gets better with time. But that hasn't been my experience, really, or the experience of many people I know that have walked through grief. Rather, I think it's more appropriate to say that it gets different with time. There's that old adage that says time heals all wounds, and I just don't think that's true. Time does heal some wounds, yes, but when it comes to deep grief, the grief doesn't necessarily shrink or go away. Dr. Lois Tonkin presented a theory decades ago that our grief doesn't get smaller over time, but rather our lives grow bigger around the grief, where it's not as all-consuming as it once was, but it doesn't go away, as illustrated in this picture that I'll put on the screen. The grief stays the same. It stays the same size, but life grows around it. And furthermore, when it comes to deep pain, there's often a hardwired desperation in us to figure out the why, right? Why are we going through this? And sometimes in religious traditions, the default has become, God is trying to teach me something. But please hear me on this. Can we learn important things as a result of going through pain? Absolutely. Pain and suffering are a part of life, and often we can learn a lot about ourselves and grow and mature in ways that we otherwise wouldn't without going through it. But that is drastically different than carrying this idea in our head that God is intentionally causing us tremendous pain to teach us some cosmic life lesson, where God never tells us the why and only leaves you and I trying to guess what the lesson is. Understand, that's not a loving parent. That's a cruel psychopath. And in the same way, the idea that God would cause someone to die so that God could have them for God's own self, that would be a very twisted, selfish monster of a God. Instead, everything we see in Jesus, which is the filter through which we're invited to see God, everything we see with Jesus was that Jesus was always serving the best interest of other people. Now, still for some of us, when intense grief comes, and because we desperately need to come up with an answer to why, some of us don't struggle as much with blaming God as much as we end up blaming ourselves. Another author, Elaine Pagels, when she talks about losing her 6-year-old child to a rare disease, she said, "After he died, I chose to feel guilty rather than feel helpless." And I find that's true for a lot of us, that we don't want to feel helpless because that seems weak. And so we choose guilt. We beat ourselves up. We create irrational narratives in our head where it becomes something like, I'm getting punished by God for this thing that I did 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Again, because in our mind, it's easier to choose guilt than feel helpless, no matter how irrational it is, because we just want some kind of traction. We just want to try to make some kind of sense out of it. And if I was to encourage you toward one more thing in the midst of walking through grief, it would just be to be intentional about not grieving alone. That whatever grief you're walking through, whether it's the passing of a loved one or the loss of a job or the loss of a dream, or marriage, a trusted friendship, any of those can carry tremendous grief. Let yourself be vulnerable enough to allow others to walk with you. Doesn't mean you have to shout it from the rooftops to everyone, but there's this lie that our culture often hands us that when pain comes, we should just suck it up and push through. And so to even acknowledge that we're really struggling feels like we're coming off as weak or helpless. And so rather than admit that, we just try to deal with it solely on our own. And in the process, we isolate ourselves from one of the greatest gifts when walking through grief, and that's the love and care of other people. And so with that in mind, my hope is that we, as Crosspointe, that we're always learning as a community how to walk with those who are grieving and to learn to do so the most lovingly way that we can. So therefore, here's a few things for us all to remember. There's a temptation for those of us trying to help someone walking through grief to also try to provide answers, to offer well-intentioned platitudes that attempt to provide answers, because again, we know that's what all of our brains default to, looking for answers to why this happened. But again, let's be reminded that even in the book of Lamentations, no answers are given, no solutions are provided. But we can be tempted to say things like in those moments, you know what, everything happens for a reason, or it's all going to work out. God has a plan for this, I promise. Or we start a sentence with, well, at least you still have this, or at least this or that didn't happen. Please avoid all of those. All of those kinds of statements do far more harm than good. And if we're honest, they paint pretty warped pictures of God. Instead, here's what I'd encourage us all to do. Just listen. Listen a lot. And listen non-judgmentally and compassionately. Just showing up and being present can often be the greatest gift you can offer someone when they're grieving. Again, you don't have to provide answers or solutions. Just be available and offer empathy. The main thing you'll likely need to discern is probably when it's best to say, come on, let's go grab some ice cream, and when it's best to just sit silently and be a loving presence. But you don't have to provide any answers, because again, it usually causes more problems than it helps when we try to do that. And additionally, try not to repeatedly ask, how can I help? Because often the person isn't going to know the answer to that. And furthermore, they're going to feel pressure to try to provide you with a solution to help you feel better by allowing you to help. And that can be incredibly stressful on the person going through grief. Instead, just initiate and do something. Drop off gift cards for food delivery services. Send a text. Leave a voicemail with no pressure for someone to return your call. If they have kids, offer to pick up the kids and do something maybe fun with them. Mow their lawn, send their favorite treats or flowers or drinks. If you have the capacity to help someone get out of their normal environment into a non-stressful space, offer that. Whatever it is, just do something where the person doesn't feel any pressure to have to take care of you as the giver, and they can just receive it or not receive it without any fear of judgment. And then after the immediacy of the loss, be someone who remembers moving forward. Put reminders on your calendar to reach out a month later, 3 months later, 6 months later, each passing year at whatever interval makes the most sense. But when someone is living with the loss of any kind, having people who make it a priority to remember and check in is a gift. Because again, the grief isn't something that just goes away over time. But that takes intention to do. It isn't something that you can just say where it's usually like, oh, I'll probably remember and reach out later on when I think of it, because life just happens. And for others not experiencing the specific grief as intensely, life just moves on. But if we want to love those who are suffering tremendous grief well, being intentional about remembering is a beautiful gift. It's how we keep showing up for people in their lives. It's how we be the gift of the village they need to make sure that they don't walk this journey alone. And I'll close with this. It's titled A Blessing for the Brokenhearted by Jan Richardson. Let us agree for now that we will not say that breaking makes us stronger, or that it is better to have this pain than to have done without this love. Let us promise we will not tell ourselves time will heal the wound when every day our waking opens it anew. Perhaps for now, it can be enough to simply marvel at the mystery of how a heart so broken can go on beating, as if it were made for precisely this. As if it knows the only cure for love is more of it. As if it sees the heart's sole remedy for breaking is to love still. As if it trusts that its own persistent pulse is the rhythm of a blessing we cannot begin to fathom, but will save us nonetheless. Amen.
no shadow of turning with thee. Thou changest not, thy compassions they fail not. As thou hast been, thou forever will be. Great is thy faithfulness, great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I have needed, thy hand hath provided. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me. Summer and winter, springtime and harvest, sun, moon, and stars in their courses above, joined with all nature in manifold witness to thy great faithfulness, mercy, and love. Great is thy faithfulness, great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I have needed, thy hand hath provided. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me. Pardon for sin and a peace that endureth. Thine own dear presence to cheer and to guide. Strength for today and bright hope for tomorrow. Blessings all mine with 10,000 beside. Great is thy faithfulness, great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I have needed, thy hand hath provided. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me. Great is thy faithfulness, great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I have needed, thy hand hath provided. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me.
If you would like to know more or get connected to Crosspointe, go to crosspoint.org. If you're in need of care or assistance, go to crosspoint.org/care. And welcome home.